Here we are for a Sunday morning edition of Dualistic Unity Raw. Coming in hot, we were talking about the chemicals in our brain and this fallacy that we experience certain disorders because of a chemical imbalance in our brain. And this is something that's been pushed for fucking years by the pharmaceutical industry, but was recently investigated. I say recently, but it was like 5 years ago or more, and discovered to be complete and utter bullpucky bullshit, absolute cow dung. There was nothing of substance there whatsoever. It was more or less just to frighten you into thinking that a medication could be your silver bullet. And to this day, it's still believed. It's funny because even though it's been debunked, there's a lot of people that will straight up say, no, 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 well, in some cases, well, there's got to be. And it's just, no, you just are you're uncomfortable about the alternative, which would be that it's not that your mentality is dictated necessarily by the chemicals in your brain, but that possibly the chemicals in your brain are dictated by your mentality. And the thing about that gets me is that when we are extremely young, we operate on a totally different set of chemicals in our brain. Not in such a way that we're not still thinking like a human being, but we operate with a neuroconductor that's much closer to DMT. I think it actually is DMT. The point being is that our brains are operating a hell of a lot faster. But if you go, okay, but yeah, then they slow down. It's like, do they? Or do we get put in school? And school teaches us to think in a very linear fashion. It teaches us about concepts and time and identity and judgment. And all of a sudden, all of that abstract thought, all of that imagination, all of that daydreaming, all of that raw potential that was soaring through us up until that point gets limited down to what's acceptable by people who aren't experiencing that anymore. And so again, the question being, is your mentality dictated by your brain? Or do you dictate your brain according to your chosen mentality? And isn't that exactly what we're talking about in terms of evolution as a whole? That it's through paying attention and adapting to one's environment, through growing as an individual and a collective, that you actually physiologically change and grow over time. But in not paying attention and essentially just closing our eyes and focusing on this little me idea, not only are we slowing down what we can possibly be aware of, and that's exactly what we're talking about all the time, isn't it? But we're also lessening the responsibility that we feel for everything else because we're closing our eyes. How can we be responsible for things that we're not willing to see? And so that's kind of like the shift in our brain or in the chemistry in our brain. All of a sudden, we're dependent on being happy or sad, right? We're very much reliant on serotonin, which is very different than the original chemistry that we started with or the chemistry that we experience in psychedelics. And so again, one has to experience or one has to question how much of our mentality shifts the chemistry in our brain. Do we do we have the capacity to still access that original chemistry in terms of the DMT possibly being secreted by our pineal gland just by thinking in a more abstract way, just by letting go of identity, just starting to experience the psychedelic nature of life here and now in a quote unquote sober state?
And so that brings into question, very much so, as you mentioned, like human nature and how much that's passed off as just the way things are. And so your point about the shift from being a kid to being an adult, basically, like we kind of have this assumption that kids think a certain way and then it starts to change and you just become less childlike. But who the fuck is to say that that isn't in response to the environment we've created with school? Like I've never thought about it like this, but of course that would make sense if maybe that childlike sort of brain and way that we act and way that we do things couldn't just continue to progress with more responsibility. And so if there wasn't school, it wouldn't be this same feeling of shifting. Because I've always thought of it like, oh yeah, you're like, yeah, like around 5, then 10, you change a little more, 15, a little more, 20. But of course, if I'm spending my day in a very specific environment, that's going to be in response to that. And so human development isn't suppressed or guaranteed to be the way that we see it develop at all. Like I've never thought of human development in that way, and how much, of course, it's based upon the situation that we're all experiencing. And so products of that, like again, it's like that shift into control, the illusion of it, the benefit then of having it, and then coupled with irresponsibility through things like, oh, it's the chemicals in your brain, you were born with it. Like that's just how you are. That's who I am. That's just the way God made me. Like, oh, the amount of fucking times I've heard that one. Like it's a complete and utter passing off of responsibility. The thought, oh, I was born this way. It's just the way I am. It's how my brain works. It's just I don't want to admit that I could change. And like to your point, if it's our mentality that impacts the chemistry, then it's entirely like on us each and every moment as we're going. Like it's a product of that as opposed to us being a product. It's like ultimate responsibility versus ultimate irresponsibility. And all of these things that we do, like, oh, it's the chemicals in my brain, are just entirely on the end of irresponsibility.
Am I coming
Oh,
through
you
okay?
cut
Because I know it
a sec.
froze there for a second. I
Yeah,
don't know if I'm
it
back.
is now.
Good?
Yes.
All right,
Yes.
cool. So, and it's not just us individually, though, of course, it is always us individually, but collectively as well. Generation by generation, we step away from a mentality that is more abstract. We step away from a mentality that does have more clarity. And again, I'd love to discuss just briefly, or rather point out just briefly, that there was a point when humanity was building empires and aqueducts and had mastered sanitation, and it was creating sculptures and artwork and beautiful things. True, there was a lot of war and violence in there, but there was also a certain degree of intelligence that was forming. This was the time of Socrates and so on and so forth. And then shortly after that, I say shortly, but say 1,000 years or more, the Dark Ages, where we suddenly couldn't remember to not live in our own shit. Like all of a sudden, over generations and generations and generations, we became so stupid that we didn't know not to shit in the street. After coming from a place when we were building empires and creating massive libraries of knowledge, creating what we look at as the ruins, but what were essentially, giant fucking buildings and all kinds of other stuff. Like we were in a totally different mentality, and then all of a sudden we just descended into stupidity. But it didn't happen all of a sudden. It happened over 1,000 years of just one generation after another, valuing shit that took us away from a place of clarity. This is why Christianity, thrived at that point, because all of a sudden everybody was terrified, and so everyone looked to the church. But the point is that over time, because we actually think this is the way that humans live, we just don't know to push that limit. And then when we do push that limit, we get judged by all the other people. So imagine being a bird that is born into a race of birds that just stopped flying, like that just stopped kicking their chicks out of the nest generations ago. And so all these birds are sitting there not knowing that they could fly, but assuming that they can't because nobody ever has. I know somebody's like, well, how did they eat? You're missing the point of the story. The point, the point of all of this is the fact that just because we think that we've always thought this way doesn't mean that we always have, nor does it mean it's the only way that we have the capacity to think. You and I had actually talked about this once upon a time, about the amount of intelligence that it would have taken early on in the development of Homo sapien to just start talking, to start conceptualizing, to actually get to that point of pushing the envelope of complexity, as it were. Like, how much would have been involved there, and how it would have taken us to creating tools, and those tools made life more convenient. Like, that took a lot of intelligence. And if you don't believe me, by all means, go out to the forest and try to survive. And don't bring a knife, motherfucker, because they didn't exist back then. Right? That shit took a lot of intelligence, generationally, becoming more intelligent about what kind of wildlife was around, what kind of food that they could eat, rather in terms of the plant life and whatnot, different ways that they could create shelters, different seasons, when the rotation of the seasons, like, all of this would have required an extreme amount of clarity. And then as we started forming more control, that clarity started to diminish, because now we didn't have to be as clear, we had control. And so it changed our mentality, and that's when we started learning more concepts, and language started to form, and everything started to get more complicated. And it was just that we didn't recognize that, while all that's great, while it's great that we're clever, the original intelligence came from that clarity, which came from a necessity, right? And what we're saying in all of our conversations is that that clarity is still a necessity, but not because some lion's going to eat your ass if you're not paying attention anymore, but because you are going to create your own suffering if you're not paying attention anymore. So attention is still the necessity. Clarity is still the necessity. Nothing's changed. It's just that we got carried away with the benefits of clarity, which is the temptation for control.
Oh man. So it's always going to be variations of products of potential. Like, for example, in that period where we were more concerned about lions, the repercussions for not paying attention were death. Like, they were right away. Whereas maybe not paying attention now, there isn't any of that side so much. Like, you can pretty much get around, maybe you're not crossing the street, not paying attention, get hit by a car or something like that. But for the most part, there isn't that immediate need at all times, high alert. But then as you don't continue to pay attention, despite not it being as much of a need, there is then the psychological suffering. And so it's like, in reality, there's always almost like not buffers, but like bounce back points where it's like enough people aren't paying attention when there's fucking wild lions running around. It's like there's going to be enough repercussions that bounces back. Now, not so much the physical, but the mental. And so you spend enough time not paying attention, you're going to suffer so much that this end is just us killing ourselves, basically, suffering to varying degrees until we're like, pay attention. But not everyone is hitting those points necessarily, but there's just variations of that. And that's, like you were saying before this call, we were talking just about chemicals in your brain, like different things. And I won't get into specifics, but like the catalyst, needing a catalyst essentially. And so even walking around talking to someone who maybe isn't willing to listen, or hasn't in themselves taken it upon them to want to do it, like, you can't convince them. You can't change them. Like, it's got to come from you. It's got to be you doing it. And I'm realizing that just more and more and more, that like there isn't anything I can say necessarily. And it doesn't even mean don't say things or offer, hey, this helped me, this did that. But like, it's it's only going to be people who are willing to look at it that want to see it. Like, they have to want something within them. There's no way to convince someone. You can't catalyst someone else. You can't be that. And oh god, it's almost like you can, in the sense, without unknowingly be it, like, and that's the point of like playing our roles. And I'm not saying like go around doing this, but say someone's catalyst was a really brutal breakup, the person who broke up with them that was that catalyst maybe felt really bad or something about that. Not it's not to say, depending on the circumstances. I'm not saying like go around breaking up with people because you'll keep being that catalyst, but like that sounds so funny. But being like you wouldn't even know that that's actually what they needed. That was their bounce back, was like how shitty they felt from that and then bouncing back. Like even being somewhat, like making fun of someone and then them beating themselves up for years, but then another thing being that catalyst. Like we never know the roles we're playing. And I'm not saying be insensitive and like be a bully or be that just because like maybe you'll be someone's catalyst, it's like, but fuck, man, like we don't really know that and we can't do it for someone else. So and that's when the conversation about like, oh, society, like what do we do about society? Like how do we fix society? It's like you can't know. It's like be willing to take in actual considerations and look at it and just be willing to look at it. And I think that's the part people don't want to look, but they want to come up with an answer. But they're not willing to look at the whole thing. But the like the bounce back or the catalyst that's always kind of there in reality on varying degrees, and we're kind of seeing it on the extreme of comfort and illusion of control, that like no, there's still ways to suffer even when you're in completely and entirely safe. And that's why we can sit in a super safe spot and immediately become afraid of everything in our environment despite there being zero physical danger remotely close. You're like thousands of miles from wild animals potentially.
Yeah, now it's just other humans you have to fear, right? And what you do to yourself. But it's interesting you talk about that quote unquote bounce back, almost like there are railings that we keep going back and forth between. And if we get too far into one, we start going towards the other. And so there is almost like this middle line that we're oscillating across. Right. And it sounds a lot like the process of intelligence. And so we're looking at the process of intelligence in a large collective sense, but that also happens in an individual sense. It happens individually. It's the same thing. If you don't pay attention to your environment, there's going to be consequences. If you pay too much attention to your environment and thus yourself within it, there's going to be consequences. And so there's a certain degree of attention to just here and now, right? Which is both you and your environment. And so there's a sweet spot that we call clarity, as it were, where you're not getting lost in the conceptual one way or another. You're not getting distracted. You're being responsible and paying attention and maturing and doing all that. But that's happening individually, which means that what's happening right now, if you want to take all of those individual oscillating little journeys that are happening and put it on in a play full of 8 billion people, it's a lot of intelligence that is currently moving around. It's a lot of intelligence that's currently processing, and we may not necessarily understand what it is that we're processing, but it doesn't mean that we're not processing it. But what we're processing is the same thing in terms of going one way in too far a direction, or the other way in too far of a direction. Like right now, we're so caught up in control that it's all about what we can do and not about what we should do at all. Right? It's like we can go to Mars. Let's go to Mars. And it's just like what? Why? Like what is the purpose of going to Mars other than giving yourself something else to do while you do nothing about what's happening around you? So it just comes down to watching intelligence play out. We are learning a lot. We're learning a lot about how much control we can have. We're learning a lot about the consequences of that control. And we're learning a lot about responsibility. Or at least it's going to end up being that way, because we're never going to get out of this loop in terms of our mental health crisis until we start coming to the reason there is one, which is our collective mentality. It has nothing to do with, again, individuals and their imbalanced brain chemistry, and everything to do with the fact that we're all going through a fucking meat grinder of society that puts pressure on us all the time. Not just pressure in terms of like financial pressure or peer pressure, self-pressure, because the entirety of our society is based on this idea of you within the society, which means that you're always trying to keep up to an invisible bar that doesn't fucking exist. And nothing in this society is trying to help you with that bar whatsoever. Everything in this society is like, there's totally a bar there. Pay attention to the bar. What's that? Are you suffering? Here, you can have a pill, but keep struggling for the bar. Please don't in any way take those mushroom shaped things that are going to make you question the bar. Because if you do that, well, studies show that you're going to do less overtime, and that's terrible for the system.
Oh my god. So, like, even this assumption that, like, society is the way it is with certain things, and, we've talked about this plenty, like, nothing is just the way it is, but, like, how deep that runs. Like, how deep are the thought as you were talking, I was like, "Fuck," like, imagining a world where there was no school, there wasn't, you know these assumptions about things, wasn't comparison so much, there wasn't so much judgment walking around, like, at all, like, almost a situation where it just straight up doesn't exist, like, kinda like, honestly, not to, like, pat ourselves on the back too much, but like how our retreats are in a lot of ways, like, it's very much there isn't any of that. Like, it is almost a different feeling world, which is why it's so uncomfortable when you're thinking about yourself and caught up with yourself. Like, it's very glaring, which I can say firsthand. But, like, in that situation, like, holy fuck, there's not the same, like, we discount how literally fucking everything is a product of a mentality. Like, the things that we do, the things that we focus on, the things day to day, moment to moment, thoughts that we have, perceptions of ourselves, the degree to which we think about ourselves, all of the disorders, quote unquote disorders that are just becoming, more and more and more, they're all products of an underlying reinforced belief in division and thus control, and as opposed to in a world where there wasn't that so much, where we were just life, closer to just being ourselves, like how, and truly expressing ourself, like how nature does, a tree or a flower, they're not trying to look right, trying to be right. They're just themselves. And like, even the thought of that sounds so obvious from a point of view of, like, of course that makes sense, but also so far-fetched. Like, given, like, even the thought that, everything that we do is a product of that. Like, the ways, even the things that we suffer about, like anxiety, just like that assumption is like, there's been worlds, parts of the world, humanity, where, like, it almost wasn't a thing, possibly. It very well could have just, like, not, like, anxiety didn't wasn't even a thing in a, like, it's always in potential, say, but, like, not really. Like, it wasn't spread throughout everywhere. And, like, the back and the forth, the response to certain things, like we were talking about the other day, anxiety being a response to the belief in control, like how extreme we take that, disappointment being a response to expectation, which stems from control. And, like, it all ties back to those beliefs in having sway in the extreme of that, but they're all products, like the way that we exist, like, as a human species, is, and everything that we do and focus on are different branches of products from a common root source, like how we perceive ourselves.
You got it. Everything comes back to that. And we have a collective way of looking at ourselves that is taught to us and ingrained in us and conditioned into us. But it's not the only one by any means. But that mentality requires itself to condition the the next generations to keep itself going. It's very much kind of like the government, right? Like the government's a great idea in terms of the United States. The idea of a government for the people, by the people, blah blah blah. That's all great, but it ends up falling apart over generations, and it ends up falling apart over generations because people become irresponsible. They start thinking of the government as its own thing instead of a product of them, right? And that's the mentality shift. This is why, again, and I love this, is there hasn't been a democracy yet that hasn't committed suicide. That was a quote by one of the founding fathers of the United States. So while they were creating a democracy, they knew it wasn't going to last if people weren't self-responsible. I say this in Discover Transcendence, and in the last part of it, of that video. I'll put the video in the QR code up for anybody who hasn't seen it. But basically, the focus wasn't on democracy, although in the United States, the government's like, democracy, that's what makes the United States great. But it's not. It was the focus on personal liberty. It was the focus on personal responsibility. That's why the idea of church and state being separate was introduced, because the church fucked with everyone. Right. So if you kept the church out of government, then it just came down to different opposing views. And that is what a government should be. If you're going to have a local government, it should be different opposing views. I've said this previously in terms of another product of our mentality, of course, is safety in numbers. The more people that agree with me, the more right I am, and thus the two-party system, right? Instead of a bunch of different people from different areas representing more different people from very different areas, talking about the priorities of those people that they represent. Instead, now you have representatives that just toe the party line and do the collective will rather than actually representing their constituents, which is why everybody votes for somebody, whether it's your member of parliament or your local congressman or something like that, on a platform that they're going to do this and this and this and this and this and this. And then they don't do any of those things, or they do very few of those things, or they even make it fucking worse over time. Well, why do they do that? Well, because they're towing the party line. They're telling you a story to get into the party, but the party is ultimately what's going to keep them going, right? Because if the party likes you, then the party is going to pour more money into you, more resources into you. And so the government becomes very much like our mentality in terms of it's just perpetuating itself, whether it's good for us or not, right? Because it's more of the illusion of control. Right. And so it all comes down to the same root. And since season 1, episode 1, and I just want to mention very quickly that there's a commentary series now that's now out. Part 1's been released, part 2's on the way. I always refer to this as the perception of division, because that's what it is. It's the perception that there is a division between things. And if there is a division between things, then there is a division between you and everything else. And while that experience is beautiful, the concept is absolute hell. And we get lost in the concept. We get lost in being so clever that we can differentiate things, that we actually start to think that those things are different, are separate. And that's really all it is just getting carried away with that. We just got too caught up in the land of make-believe. And we forgot that there was an actual mentality that wasn't pretending, that we could participate in and live in and actually feel quite fulfilled by. But right now we're just playing make-believe. We even have pretend money.
And oh man, you've said previously, like, you kind of see everything as symbolism in a sense. And like I've admittedly never really, I've gotten kind of what you mean, like, oh yeah, symbolism, but like symbolic of a mentality, one that isn't disconnected. And so the ways that everyone acts, the responses that we have, the focus on certain things versus other things, the actions that we take, things that we do, are all symbolic of a fluctuating mentality, a fluctuating priority. And so it's not even that there's not a better or a worse, there's not a right or a wrong. It's just options and a willingness to be honest with yourself about things. Be honest to look at the things maybe that you're avoiding, because someone in, like, being on, like going to Mars, like being honest about your own self and experience, like that is a product of avoidance, but all of it is, so much of it is that willingness, and not even in a right or a wrong direction, but if everything right now is starting to be seen more and more as everything's just that product of a given mentality of control, like there's always going to be the potential for me to recognize that I'm not in control. Like there's always that potential. And so you've talked about, even just like dualistic unity as a whirlpool within, the infinite ocean of potential. And so, yeah, no wonder there can't be like, no wonder we can't look around to like, see how another podcast does something, because I wrestle with that. Often, I will not lie. There are times where I want to look to a structure or a thing or a way to do stuff. And I know it's like, norm, but all of that is a product of a given mentality. And I'm not even saying it like, oh, dualistic unity is some separate thing from everything else. Like everything else is on that symbolic scale as well, but a component of the willingness to not be in control is to not look around so much, have faith in yourself, like not prepare so much, even, be willing to like not prepare at all, just to, and again, that's on fluctuations. Like you can be super, super prepared. That doesn't guarantee anything. You can be not prepared at all. That doesn't guarantee anything. But how willing you are to roll with what happens moment to moment, which not taking yourself so seriously can help with a lot, because then maybe you'll be willing to let go of the assumption of how you want something to go, assuming that that's best, assuming that that's a thing that you can do. And so without that assumption, you're like, all right, I can prepare sort of, I'll do maybe a couple things, but like even that can be futile. So that's on a scale too. That's a product of a given mentality, the rigidity, but then the products of the need to do it well and the fear of it based on judgment, based on, doing this well is going to get me to this and this and this and this and all of these assumptions, and just making the assumption that my assumptions can be correct, and like how much I believe that, like how much I believe that my perception of reality is reality versus recognizing that it's actually entirely not. It's like it is, but it's not. And so it's all on these fucking scales, like fucking everything that we do.
Yeah, absolutely. And that is why I find dualistic unity to be incredible. It is because from the very start, it's had the foundation of we're not trying to save anyone. And that took me so long to understand. Forever, and I know we have people who ask this question in our groups and on Discord, and people go through this, and we all go through this, where you want to get this across to someone, you want to tell them about it because you see them suffering. They're telling you about their suffering, and you're like, well, hey, you might want to take yourself less seriously if you thought about, questioning the idea of yourself. And all of a sudden, there's all kinds of blowback, and you're the bad guy, and they're questioning your life choices, and they're doing all that, and it's because they're protecting themselves, which is a product of that mentality. Right. And so recognizing that, the only thing that you can do is learn from the finger trap. Stop pulling, right? Or in this case, stop pushing. Live your life, be yourself, actually relax. And that is the ripple. And it's completely counterintuitive. And it's the reason that dualistic unity is so unique, is because this is a product, more and more so, of a deepening sense of relaxation, not just about ourselves, but about the world, about our listeners' ability to cope with all of this, to learn from it. Because admittedly, it's very easy to panic, but that panic comes from a lack of faith in yourself, which comes from the mentality of control, right? And so a lot of our panic just comes down to the idea, like, are we going to get it? Are we going to get all of this under control? It's like, how do you know that's the right idea? How do you know that's not what's making it worse? Because that's what we're trying to do, right? I mean, this is the thing about the crash in 2008. Ron Paul was still around at the time, and Ron Paul's an economist, and he has been talking about what's going to happen in the economy since the 80s. Like, the dude's been on par like since the 80s. He rivals Bernie Sanders in terms of being like instrumental for a lot of what's happening in terms of people being aware of the financial system, of the Federal Reserve, all of that stuff. Anyway, Ron Paul was coming out, and he was talking about all this. Fuck, I was going somewhere with this. Ah, shit.
The crash, 2008, and Ron Paul.
Right. So Ron Paul was saying, like, yeah, this is a correction. It's a correction that has to happen because we keep inflating these bubbles, and that's causing the devaluing of the dollar, which causes more inflation of bubbles later on. And so we need to let this correction happen. Otherwise, we're going to end up with another bubble in terms of, it just moving to another problem, which is what's happening right now. So his point was, let the crash happen. Like, let these companies that have essentially made bad choices fall. Let it just have its fucking effect on the economy. Sure, there's going to be some pain for a little while, but once it's done, the market will have corrected. Houses will be the right price. Everything will change in terms of the economy shifting. But instead, we're like, no, too big to fail. And why do you think we say that? Because it's going to be uncomfortable for us. And so we just move the debt, right? In this case, we moved it onto the taxpayer, right? Which is taking its toll now. The point being is that we keep doing this, where we just keep putting off the consequence in the same way that we put off the consequence for trying to control things in our own life, right? Which is fear and anxiety and depression and frustration. All of that comes from trying to put off the consequence of control, or all of that is the consequence of control, right? Because the more you think you can be in control, the more you can not be in control. And that is a measure of your value. And there's all kinds of merry hell that goes with it. Right. But yeah, Ron Paul didn't make a lot of friends for saying that the economy should just fall at all. But he wasn't wrong.
And because avoidance and kicking the can down the road is another product of the mentality that's going to keep doing it. And so there's little bubbles of recognitions, but like the overarching mentality is gonna kick the can down the road because that's what that existing mentality does when it comes to facing that, dealing with it. Like, that's a component of the mentality. And so it's like this cycle, which is always in potential to be looked at and be like, yo, hold up. There's something that's going to keep happening. But another product of that belief and the underlying belief being I am what I think I am, and therefore, I can let's just kick the can down the road for 100 years and then, wipe my hands. But you have to, so you have to be willing to expand that a little bit and recognize, but like it's almost it's not actually unfathomable, but it's way more difficult in a given overarching mentality. And so it's not to say that they're like, because believe like, there's like I was saying with the scales, like there's the scale in being what you think, and therefore, having a lifetime of 80 to 100 years, or other end is like recognizing that that's not you. But then the considerations of, all right, let's roll up our sleeves, and like we have sway, and we think that avoiding it is helping us perpetuate, existing a mentality that's the best mentality. But if you're willing to look, then it's like seeing those things make more sense as you're more relaxed in yourself. And so another fucking scale that we were talking about a couple days ago was like tension to relaxation. And if that's almost not like that's a massive component that ties hand in hand with like perceiving yourself as separate versus not perceiving yourself as separate. Like those are like, if you're entirely separate, there's a lot of tension there versus it's almost like in a thing of glue, I don't know, like a big bucket of glue or something that's kind of like jiggly, loose, just a mat or jello or whatever. But then you take off a tiny little piece and it hardens very quickly, or it shifts or whatever. Maybe it's like too hard, you can't wiggle it as much. And like that's, I don't know, like symbolic of, or an analogy that could be used for perceiving yourself as separate, like the degree of tension versus not. And so tension to relaxation. So, but they're all kind of like reinforcing each other, like the focuses that we have on certain things, the focus on, life after we die, like how that's the extreme versus prioritizing, no, my experience right now. And like they're all tying. So like we actually prioritize dying because we've been able to go to the so far extreme that there's like we made up an imaginary place after this. But then that's so believing in that as a product. So it's like we're all kind of like shaken loose a little bit of the rust and cobwebs of coming out of an existing mentality, but still with the focus on, certain things. And again, not to say wrong, but like, and just quick example, like for like maybe running and consistently running is a product of mentality of control, get what you want. Oh, like do things faster so I can get what I want and do this and all of that. But like I've come to enjoy running and like so within it's still probably very much so a product of a given mentality and yet also not because like kids run around and play and so it's not like I'm making that assumption. It's the way maybe you do it that is. So, doing it with the need to constantly improve and like do it as fast as you and like reach your full potential again doesn't mean that that's your focus is on yourself necessarily. It's most likely, but then like, so just for myself, because I would have never been able to do this, 5 years ago, even I probably would have like had set a goal, tried to reach the goal for, a marathon time or something. And I didn't really think about it and like enjoyed it the whole time, but I was still doing a thing that's a product of a given mentality in a certain way, like the accomplishment of a marathon. And that's, I don't know, maybe why I felt kind of like funny about it. Like I was aware that I was kind of doing something that most people do to feel better about themselves, but wasn't. And it's not to say that I'm not going to lie, but like I didn't certainly as much as I would have, like the thought of I did this and I'm now a marathoner or something, like it didn't cross my mind as much. And so I don't know, it's just hitting me like all the scales of like products of given mentalities, but you can still do the thing while not having it yourself. And so it does just come back to you, but so much of what we do is stemming from an existing overarching mentality.
Yeah, because that mentality couldn't just run because it was fun. It would have to mean something about it. Right. And that's very much it. Because again, it's about you. In the perception of division, there's a you that's measurable. Not only is there a you that's measurable, there's a you that can end. And there comes our fear of death and the need for a fiction about the afterlife where we continue because we don't want to let go of that fucking focus on me. right? And that's the mentality. And so even the belief in the afterlife and heaven and hell and all that other fun stuff, and God, can't forget the big man in the sky, just comes down to a fixation on this fiction of myself. Because if that fiction is true, then all of these things are possible. If I'm separate, then all of these things are possible. If it's just me, there's a difference. But that's another reason that we can do what we're doing with the world kind of willy-nilly, is because we're not our children, right? It's not our problem what we leave behind, right? Not in my backyard. Do you remember that one, NIMBY? Not in my backyard. It's all your backyard. You are the yard. Like, you're the whole fucking thing. But in the perception of division, there's a you and there's your neighbor and there's your yard and their yard. There's a property and there's ownership. There's comparison. There's competition, right? There's responsibility for yourself and not anybody else, right? Not my brother's keeper. It all goes back to those original stories that we were talking about previously, right? But it all comes back to the same mentality of division, that there must be something other than me. Somebody asked this the other day. You made a video, and somebody was saying, like, well, there was nothingness before I was alive, and there's going to be nothingness after I die. That's all I have to worry about. And so I asked him, I'm like, have you ever actually experienced this nothingness that you're vouching for? Have you? Has anyone at all? Why do you assume you're going somewhere? Why do you assume that it's not just all of you in every incarnation all the time? That there is in fact no beginning or end, that there was never a point where before you were born, because we were all born at the same time with different perceptions of time. In fact, there was no time before birth. And if there's no time before birth and there's no time after death, then time itself is a function of the living, in which case the entire experience of time is always happening. You're not going anywhere. You're everyone all the time. The perception, the experience of time ends with life. And if there's no experience of time, then none of this happens. So this always happens in the perception of time. But you can't look at it that way. You can't see it all as you, as life, as the beginning and the end, as you as your neighbor, so long as you are focused on the idea of yourself. So long as you are focused on the mentality of division, of control. It blinds you to yourself. It blinds you to everything that is your existence. It blinds you to questioning anything. Because you always have to fit in. You always have to be in control. You're always measuring your progress. You can't fucking be wrong. And all of that gets in the way of introspection, self-reflection, self-honesty, empathy. And so instead, we rely on structures like morality and religion and the word of God telling you what to do. Because without that, you're probably going to be an asshole because of the mentality that you're embodying. And so we try to put safeguards against our own selfishness. And we call it the word of God, while that in itself is an act of selfishness.
Oh man, dude, this been a very fun call so far. Like, holy Christ, like, like we have to put in safeguards because it wouldn't, in a given mentality, it wouldn't really make sense to be a quote unquote good person because it would be entirely on the end of selfishness. Like, it's selflessness versus selfishness as well. Like, there's so many variations of scales, but like that is closely tied to tension, relaxation, perception of division, like entirely. And so in a world that is entirely focused on me, as the idea, and again, like, even I'm probably going to get on this tangent and forget where I was going, but whatever. Even in the conversation, there being the talk of like being everything, or like the conceptual idea of being everything is a product of the existing mentality. So, because without that, because I was having this, and like the last couple of days have been interesting to say the least. Just in my head, I guess, or whatever, like ups and downs and fucking craziness. But I was talking about something like, or I made a video like, you can't think about yourself. Just straight up, you can't. And then people were responding like, "Oh, you must be Buddhist," or, "Oh, we're the," or no, something like, "Exactly, we're the universe," doing that. But it's like, even that, like, you can't say that and think we're the universe. Even saying we're everything, like, you can obviously say it, but immediately it becomes a conceptual thing. So it's not even, it's like, no, you're not what you think, period. Like there's nothing there. And it's not nothing. Because it's also, as soon as you start thinking, oh, nothing's there, it's like you conceptualize nothing. And it's like nothing and everything. The paradox, of course, because it's all there and yet it's not what you're thinking about. But as soon as there's the thought of it's to make me feel better, because it can be very uncomfortable to realize I can't think about myself. And it's like, I want there to be something. And it's like, okay, I'm everything. And yeah, right there, it's like, okay, whew, well, I know that. It's like, no, not even that. That's a product wanting to know that, and feeling better from knowing that is a product of, again, mentality. And so we're like, oh God, fuck, dude. It's like we're constantly, there's products of a mentality and then us and whatever we're doing. And it's kind of like, not in a, I'm not saying in a battle, because I think even saying that is like a product of a mentality of there being a fight, of there being a back and forth, of there being something that I'm going through, even, and expressing it and saying this or that is also a product of a mentality. And that's why this has been so hard to, like, dualistic unity and everything for me to, like, reconcile with, because like everything I am is stemming from a mentality and yet not, like, always in the potential to, you know recognize that I'm not what I think I am, period. Not even the universe or a soul and a body and all that shit.
Thus, Dualistic Unity as a title. Very happy about it. Gotta say, still don't know how it miraculously just came to the surface really early on and fairly easily. Like we settled on it pretty quickly, and it's absolutely apt to this conversation because that's exactly what it is. But it's the awareness of that changes everything. It really is. It's just the understanding of it, but it's not the conceptual understanding. I think it can only be come to by going through it enough times, and it's because of the product that we're in. It'd be like, again, you go back to this fictitious species of bird that hasn't learned to kick its children out of the nest early enough. Let's just say, you can take the symbolism for that however you like. um, Eventually one of those birds is going to start flapping its wings, trying to develop the strength to do so, and all the other birds are going to go, the fuck is wrong with you? But then through that bird flapping its wings, it develops some strength, and all of a sudden it's learning how to flap its wings. Maybe it never learns to fly. Maybe it just develops a way to dance. Either way, though, it's developing strength that a couple of generations down the road might have more people, which might end up developing more strength, which may eventually lead somebody to fucking fly. But it has to come down to you. And you can't be waiting for everybody around you to do it. I've said it before that the mentality that very much set me free, I would say, was the understanding that it is entirely possible that everyone's totally forgotten reality. It's entirely possible that everyone is caught up in this mentality of division. And if that's the case, it really is just on me. And that's the reason it means so much to me, because it's on me. I'm responsible for my own awareness. I'm responsible for the shit that I'm putting myself through, as well as the ability to stop doing it. And that changes everything, because I'm not doing it for you. You see, I'm not trying to change the world. I'm not trying to change anyone else, because that's all a product of that mentality too. And so it has to be just about me flapping my wings, because maybe I can fly. right? And the more I start to recognize, oh shit, I, all I've been really doing is stopping myself from flapping my wings. It's the most natural thing to do. It's the most natural thing to do to be in reality. Like you were talking about running, and you're like, well, it's the product of a mentality if you're thinking about yourself. Yeah. Otherwise, it's just putting one leg in front of the other. Which is the most simple thing in the world. But that's the point, right? Is that if it means something about you, it's very different than if it doesn't. And when you start to recognize none of this shit means anything about you, that it's all just additional considerations for your intelligence to chew on and spit something out in terms of a response. That's all life is. You just have to move forward. You have to stop to just don't have to think about yourself. But again, like so many people have talked about this. That's why immediately you get the response like, "Oh, you must be Buddhist." It's like, why? Because there was a guy named Buddha who was talking about the same thing. Is that why I must be Buddhist? Or Jesus talking about faith. It's like you start talking about having faith in yourself, start talking about letting go, you start talking about connection to your neighbors. All oh, you must be Christian, you must be following Jesus. It's like, why? Because he was talking about the same thing. Is that why? Is that why I must be following him? What if a whole bunch of people just keep coming to the same fucking point and everybody just insists on following them because of the mentality? So everybody keeps making the same point in the best way that they can, and everybody else misinterprets it because of that dominant mentality. But it's the only way to make enough ripples that the dominant mentality starts to change. It's to do it for you. To say it regardless of the response. Flap your fucking wings. Right? And that's how everything changes. But if everybody's afraid to try, if everybody's judging one another, which again, product of that mentality, then we are a crab bucket. As soon as somebody tries to crawl out, we all try and pull them back in because we can't crawl out. So that's why it's so important to take it upon yourself. There's no one to save. Be free. You're the only one that can. You're the only one that can allow yourself to just let go. Because that's the real bitch about this, is that we're really just going through self-dialogue about whether or not we can let go. And it's the self-dialogue that is the act of not letting go.
Jesus Christ, dude. And this has been a really fun episode. Oh my God. So with someone like Jesus and so everything has the potential to be on a sliding scale. So even say, and there's such a pull to be from both sides, kind of like I brought it up a number of times with the pull, the fields that David Hawkins talks about in Power versus Force, ego versus unity, like division versus unity. Like that's kind of for all of the spectrums we've been talking about, like there's that sort of gravity. So in the middle, there can be almost like this fluctuation that both sides have the potential, and certain as you veer into one, it's like there's like a snapback, but also there's a pull the more you get. And that's why going, and I say going back and forth between thinking about yourself or not, or having a moment where you're like, oh fuck yeah, this is what I forgot about, or whatever, one of those moments where you're clear, you're very clear. And then but then as soon as there's the you go, the veil crosses over, whatever, there's then a pull immediately, and it's like coming up for air and then going back into it. But that potential is always there. It's not the thought that it is like a snap of the finger and then it's like magic, you're clear and free forever, is a kind of a product of our mentality, overarching mentality now, that there should be that, that there should be a point where you're like, This is it. It's done. I'm I'm now everything forever. Like even that assumption that maybe that could happen. And so there's not even like a scale that we're going through that then it's just always in flux, in potential, stemming from me, always. Stemming from you, always. Like depending, so it's not a point, there's not like a crossover ever. It's it's just there's the poles depending on maybe when you do come up for air, where your focus goes back to, like how long you maintain the responsibility. Or, and again, not that it's something that can be maintained, but there's a pull given, because again, it's not a conceptual thing at all. It's very much stems from actions and decisions and prioritizations, and there is it's going to be dependent upon that in a lot of ways as you do fluctuate, and maybe you like, you know, have a moment of clarity, but the pull is going to be there to some degree, and like being willing to look at the pull and like, been there. I know that one well. I kind of know where that goes. Whereas like maybe the first couple times you are there, you're like, yeah, it still looks pretty good. And it's like I'm simplifying that, but that's kind of, it's like in scales, moment to moment, but also day to day, week to week, month to month, always in potential, but it's like likelihoods shift around given the environment to some degree.
It's so interesting because pride and courage are just a hair's breadth apart, right? Like you can be incredibly productive, incredibly good at what you're doing, clear, motivated, getting shit done. But if it's about you, then it takes the form of pride. If it's not about you, then it's just what life is. It's just moving forward, and that's courage, right? But if it's about you, then it's pride. And as they say in the Bible, pride goeth before the fall, right? Because if you're proud and then all of a sudden things take a shit, you get torn down. Whereas if you are just facing life and things take a shit, you just continue on. And that's the difference. They look identical almost in that you are still dealing with life moment to moment to moment. But there's just that little bit that still means something about you. And that's why Hawkins talks about the division between the egocentric life and the selfless life being that line between pride and courage, right? That being the first real significant change in someone's life is when they stop making it about them and they just start making it about life. And it's because you stop dwelling on that concept of you. But as you said, you'll go back and forth because you'll get a lot of shit done and suddenly you'll want to feel really good about it. Right. And then you will. And then all of a sudden you'll feel the pressure that goes with feeling really good about it and the need for control and all of that spiral of selfishness will come back. Right. And so it's going through that oscillating back and forth. But that's exactly what he's talking about in Power versus Force, is that there is the draw of control. Right. And there is another part of us that can have the same kind of draw more so, but it does not try to entice us. It's something that has to be found through just surrendering and being where you are. And as you get used to being where you are, it evolves. It goes from courage to acceptance, right? And then from acceptance, it becomes reason. Now, because you're just like, well, it is what it is, and I'm not going to focus too much on my preferences or control. I'm not going to take myself too fucking seriously. Holy shit, that's happening. Oh wow, that's happening. Oh wow, I never noticed people did that. And so all of a sudden, because you have all this extra clarity and now this extra attention, because you're not focused on the bullshit that is the fiction of you, you can reason like a motherfucker. All of a sudden you are able to take in more information. All of a sudden you do feel more intelligent. You are getting more done. And there comes again the temptation to self-define as an intelligent person. right? Which becomes another point of pride, which means you're going to oscillate back and forth between that shit. Intelligent and then weighing your intelligence and doing all that. And then beyond that comes joy and love. Why do you think that is? Well, because you take yourself less seriously even again. Right? And every time you do, you feel a little bit less above everyone else and a little bit more as everyone else. But it's just directions. How much do you want to think about yourself? And the more you think about yourself, the more consequences thereof. It just keeps happening that way. Right? And it's because you are trying to compete with something that does not exist in reality. You're trying to live in a world that is completely based on the fiction that your value is measurable and that you are separate. And so everything that we do is based on that. But back to your original point, it's interesting because we'll always have the choice. See, reality will always be here. Reality is here. It's funny, there's nowhere for us to go. It's just about letting go and being where we are, right? Like it's always going to be the case. And there will always be the capacity to think about ourselves in reality. They're always going to exist side by side. They're both options. And it's a matter of keeping them both in mind because you will be informed by the perspective of how you are interacting with your neighbors. When somebody comes up to you and says, hey, you're being a bit of a dick, that's a product of division. The conversation itself is a product of the perspective of division. The fact that you think you're talking to somebody as a whole is a product of the perspective of division, right? That said, take that too far, you start judging that person as being an asshole rather than going, fuck, that's a part of me that's reflecting something back at myself that maybe I should look at. And so it changes things. You can be informed by thought without actually thinking it means anything about you. Right? If somebody says you're a dick, you can go, it's interesting. I wonder why they're saying that. And then you can look at your own actions. You can go, maybe I was being dickish. That doesn't mean you're a dick. But now that you've looked at the considerations that were inspired by somebody else's response, you've grown, you've changed. That's part of the process. Right? But when we start defining ourselves, everybody calls me a dick. Nobody likes me. Nobody's ever going to like me. And it just becomes this fucking vicious circle of being angry all the time and pissed off and in despair. And it's because of a story that, you might feel has justification, but you're just making assumptions. You're making inductive reasoning. You're going, it's always happened to me, therefore it's always going to happen. Or rather, deductive reasoning. Right? But that doesn't work because life changes all the time. What if all of a sudden, through you feeling like a dick for your entire life, you can empathize with somebody who's beating themselves up even more? And in that moment, you're like, yeah, I know what that's like. Just remember, we all beat ourselves up. You make a ripple that person can change their path. You still a dick? Right? Were you ever? Or were you just learning more for that moment? See, it's not about how you think about yourself. It's not about your idea of yourself. You are a part of everything, not the conceptual everything. Because as Andrew was saying earlier, as soon as you think of everything, you have an idea of that. As soon as you think of the universe, you have an idea of that. As soon as you think of reality, you have an idea of that. Just be. Just be. You don't have to think about yourself to the degree that you think you do, which is kind of a funny statement in itself.
And another thing that's on that fucking scale, it's like how much you think about yourself and like how often that happens throughout the day. And so all of these again are products of that and just the willingness to like the willingness to not do it for, and you said something at the end there that I was like, that really, really hits home. And now I'm having a tough time remembering it. And it's almost like a part of me probably doesn't want to remember maintaining if I'm going to then judge myself and think, and again, there it is. And then I remember what it was and the jump from all of the things and say like on that sliding scale of Hawkins, like there's always you take that to the extreme and like, joy and whatever and enlightenment and like or any of those and you can think about yourself as something and it's almost like the draw to do it as you go gets higher, especially if you're used to thinking about yourself judgmentally, kind of like I very much felt that when I was on acid. Like I was not, there was no doubt anymore. There was no self-criticism. And I was like, and then it was like the pullback from that. It was like, yeah, oh yeah, yeah, I could do a lot. I am pretty like incredible. Like it was extreme ego then, because like the pulls that maybe because I was feeling more of like, you know, courage or lack of whatever the lack of doubt was, then there was then the pull to think about myself in that. And so the fluctuations, but then there's bounce back between that back and forth. And then it's like, all right, oh, I can do more. I am pretty good at this or that. And then without so much thought of like it means something about me, it's like, oh yeah, I don't know that. Also, still, even when it's I'm feeling better about myself, and depending on how good you feel about yourself based on a certain thing, there's going to be the blowback there kind of inevitably. Like we're on this self-regulating, not to say that I don't even know whether to say, not to say that whether we're in control or not in control or whatever, but there's like almost like natural responses in a sense because we're not divided from our experience. So of course, it's like the karma conversation we've had before. It's like you're karma in the sense of if you think you're your hand and you punch your shoulder, you're going to feel some of that to some degree. It's like you're doing it to yourself. It's not karma in this magical sense of like it the universe is guiding it. It sees you do that and then it's going to bring it back around to you. It's like you're doing it to yourself. You're judging yourself. You're feeling certain ways about yourself. You're focusing on yourself way too much, which then if it's the idea, it's not focusing like the degree to which we focus on ourselves is the degree to which we don't focus on our environment. And that's always on a sliding scale as well. And so in fucking, it's like, I can't even say society. It's just me, but like the willingness to just not look, like the movie, Don't Look Up. And so we see these products, like all of these are symbolic of certain things, and then it got pushed as like a leftist agenda, the movie, and all of them were like liberals, and so there's like, oh, I'm not going to watch it or whatever. It's like, oh, and there's always the ability, and then someone else does something but you have a preconceived notion about it, so there's an unwillingness to look there, and we're constantly just like and I even we is like a product of the phrase "we" is kind of like another product of give mentality, depending on how much of an idea of "we" you have versus just, you know, more convenient than saying explaining like "we," but not really "we" because it's just me and blah, blah, blah. It's like more convenient to say that, but it's like, how much do you actually believe it?
Exactly. It's funny how all of us are here experiencing things from the perspective of I, but suddenly somehow we became we, instead of just I from numerous different points of view, because that's confusing, right? But that's the point, is that that doesn't have to be an unknown conversation. That doesn't have to be something that our species doesn't take into account. It's just become something our species doesn't take into account because it's become something I don't necessarily take into account, right? And so I'm changing. I'm learning from it, and that causes ripples in the rest of me. And that's worth it. That's enough for me, you know, because it's for me. I'm rippling for me, as me, within me. That's pretty much it. And not even me. See, that's the funny part. Like, it's not the me I'm thinking about. It's not the me that you're thinking about. It's what remains when we're not thinking about it. This has been a hell of a lot of fun. I feel compelled to mention that we have a video contest right now. If you'd like to see details about that video contest, you can check it out, dualisticunity.com. Under community, you will see viral video contest where you can win a free ticket to our upcoming mini retreat in California in April. We have 5 tickets left for our Virginia Beach mini retreat on February 1st to February 5th. You can find the details on the website as well. Patreon supporters get mad discounts. It's awesome. We're going to continue on in 15 minutes on Patreon. You can join us. There's a tier 2 and a tier 3 call today. Patreon.com/dualistic unity. This has been a lot of fun. I'm looking forward to the conversation that follows.
Likewise, this has been a blast. Then I'm going to leave it there because we're at time.